One of the other big issues at this time was the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. So this group was founded in the late 1860s, and it started as a Confederate veterans organization. But really what it turned into was systematic terrorism against people who supported Reconstruction governments. They would dress up in these dumb white robes and pretend they were dead Confederate soldiers. Look at how cool they look in their stupid white robes. Alright, so they would terrorize basically African Americans, and unfortunately at this time African Americans were not allowed to have guns anywhere in the country. Those were basically state laws taking away and stripping away and chipping away at their Second Amendment right. So we're going to have essentially a homegrown terrorist group terrorizing African American freedmen from trying to vote, trying to have the franchise, trying to participate in the new government. They were dedicated to restoring the quote-unquote old social order. By the early 1870s, there's going to be a movement to have the pre-war elite come back into power. Now, these were called the Redeemers. They were not the Klan. They were not so crude as the Klan, but they were a group of men who wanted to get back into power, and they called themselves the Redeemers. They were Democrats. So the KKK violence is separate from the Redeemers, although sometimes some Redeemer candidates would support KKK violence. However, you are going to have essentially former Confederates trying to get back into power. And at the same time, the KKK terrorism continued on, and it was so horrible that federal legislation was passed where the feds could actually use the army to stop the KKK. And in those places, the Klan actually did start to decline. So another example of the need to reform and to protect African Americans was with the passage then of the 15th Amendment. So remember that the 14th Amendment, it clearly lays out that blacks are made citizens of the United States. And you might think that, gee, if you're a citizen, you have the right to vote. But it didn't actually use the word vote. So it was, remember, state constitutions that had been granting African American men the franchise in order to come back into the Union. But now there is going to be the 15th Amendment put forth by the radical Republicans, hoping that it would prevent state legislatures from trying to disenfranchise freedmen in the future. This, of course, isn't going to actually, once again, be effective, but it says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, the most immediate effect ended up being the enfranchisement of northern black citizens. Since the South had already franchised had franchised black men in their state constitutions, most northern governments actually had not. And so the 15th Amendment, the biggest impact is actually going to be in the North. It basically takes the 14th Amendment a step further by explicitly adding, yes, freedmen have the right to vote. Of course, unfortunately, this doesn't include women. The suffragists were very upset by this, but it did not apply to women, although it clearly should have. All right. So the early phases then of Reconstruction, just a little bit of a summary. We have the 14th and 15th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment explains citizenship. The 15th Amendment says essentially who cannot be denied the right to vote. But it doesn't create what's called a positive right to vote. It doesn't, there's a difference between saying who can't be denied versus that you have it. So the other thing that is going to go on in these early phases of Reconstruction is that states are going to find ways to disenfranchise blacks without using race as the reason. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more next class, but that's going to be with things like the poll tax, the grandfather clause, and literary tests. So if you want to vote, you have to be able to do X, Y, and Z. In addition, despite the fact that the 14th Amendment said that anyone who participated or supported in the rebellion, if you didn't allow your citizens the right to vote, the state would lose that percentage of its representatives. It never actually happened. It never actually was enforced. So there was no rule really to back it up. And then finally, Johnson is going to continually undermine the Reconstruction effort, specifically with the 14th Amendment. This is going to weaken the power of the presidency. It's not good form for the president to go out and campaign the way Johnson did against Reconstruction and against civil rights. And then he is going to really help ensure another century of racial oppression due to the fact that he just really could not get on board Reconstruction. So by the end of 1876, we were actually at the end of Grant's second term. Only 3 of the former Confederate states had not been redeemed, meaning that they'd had those redeemer governments. Those were the states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. So that means basically they are they still had Republican governments. So by the election of 1876, Grant had actually indicated that he wanted to run for a 3rd term. There was no term limit yet in our Constitution. But his administration was so corrupt that the Republicans decided, no, this is way too much. So the Republican Party splits into different groupings. There were the group of Republicans called the half-breed Republicans who wanted some reform for the South. There were the stalwart Republicans who didn't want any reform. And basically those candidates are going to split each other out, cancel each other out. And ultimately, the Republicans are going to nominate the Republican governor of Ohio named Rutherford B. Hayes.